Hello, I'm Darius Udrys, Vice Rector for Development and Communications at the European Humanities University. Welcome to this EHU Public Conversation, sponsored by Novotel Vilnius Center. Today's guest is Nick Holdsworth, journalist and foreign correspondent who writes for the Sunday Telegraph, The Times, Variety, and other English language publications. Based in Moscow, Holdsworth is an expert on the contemporary cinema of the former East Bloc. He has also written a book about a generation coping with its Soviet past. In this EHU Public Conversation, Holdsworth shares his insights on transition processes in Eastern Europe, and Russia in particular.
On one day, I don't know what it was, but I suddenly thought, well, hang on, in Europe, we had, over the course of 500 years, we had the Reformation, we had the Renaissance, and then we had the Enlightenment. And it struck me that those three huge, massive changes in European culture and society have affected each and every one of us as Europeans. We somehow have inculcated the principles and the approaches and the idea of individual responsibility, and also the idea of what is God and what is our place in the universe. I mean, all those things that sort of come out of those movements in our kind of social, personal, genetic makeup. And, I think of my late grandmother, who was, born in a rural, well, not quite rural, but born in a provincial city, but grew up really in the countryside in, more than 100 years ago now. And even she, with a relative lack of education, espoused ideas that I've never found espoused by provincial babushki in Russia. And it just struck me that perhaps those factors make us European, and those in Russia who aren't inheritors to that tradition don't have that in their makeup. And, I thought more about it, and I thought, well, the intelligentsia there make the effort to inculcate those values. And it just strikes me that there is a very different Russian attitude, and there's the Russians are much more emotional than I ever imagined. I'm sure that this audience probably knows Russians better than many in the West, through experience of either ethnic Russians or Russian speakers, or your own travels, or growing up during the Soviet Union, perhaps some of you. So it just struck me that the Russians really do come from a very different background. There's a degree of emotionalism there, despite the strength of the Orthodox Church. There's a degree of almost kind of superstitious pagan sort of element in their characters, and they don't always see things in at all logical, reasonable, reasoning ways. And I think that's very evident in the completely apparently quixotic events in the last month or so around Ukraine and the Kremlin's policy, and some of Vladimir Putin's statements. Some of that may be calculated, some of that may actually be part of this sense. They've not really had any kind of huge cultural reaction. They haven't in any way at all dealt with their history. In a country where 3 or 4 years ago you have a national poll on great Russians, and Stalin, I can't remember whether he was number 1 or number 2, that suggests that there's been no self-reflection. And I think this comes back to the earlier point that there is a lack of self-reflection. Russians aren't trained in that. It's not in their nature. If you look at their history, there are these great waves of repression and murder and genocide at certain times of history. Then there's relatively short periods where things relax, and there's a breathing space, and there's an openness, and then you get another great wave. And each new wave tends to completely throw away what had gone before and completely ignore the past. And I think if you don't actually work through your history and work through your past, then that traps you to a certain extent. And it's very interesting what Angela Merkel said a week or 2 ago about Putin, that his seeing the world through a completely Soviet prism, that he's living in a different world, in another century indeed, in the 20th century, not the 21st, and is coming at problems. I think our Prime Minister Cameron or Foreign Secretary Haig said something about you can't deal with political issues around the world in this 20th century, or maybe even the 19th century, I don't know. You know, you just go and grab another country. You know, back in the 70s and 80s, you know, there were criminologists, people who understood every last detail of a relationship between all these 18, 90-year-old men who were running the country. And one of the first things that happened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, certainly in Britain, was that Russian studies departments at universities were being closed down. I remember writing about it for the Times Higher Education Supplement, for whom I used to work. Thatcher, I think it was when Thatcher was still Prime Minister, was shutting down Russian studies departments. And later, I don't know if they still have it, but certainly in the 90s there used to be a joint Chiefs of Staff Council, and the British military would send bright officers over to study Russian alongside Russians in St. Petersburg and other places. And I remember going and doing a story about that as well. And, you know, these guys are working together. The Russians are learning English. The English are learning Russian. And there was really quite a degree of engagement. And that's all good, because you do really get to know people when you study together, and certainly when you drink together. And I'm not sure that we really have people who thoroughly well understand the Russians. Vladimir Putin, one of the things that defines his character is that he's a judo expert. And it's quite clear that he takes from judo this concept that you always think 3 or 4 moves ahead. You always try to understand what your opposing judo master, you know, what his tactic is, and you try to keep him off balance, because the whole game is to trip somebody over, to spill them over. And that's how he plays international politics. I'm not sure it's diplomacy right now, although the diplomats do appear to be working. Aggression and anger is often, probably always, a mask for fear. So when you see an aggressive action, what's behind that? Fear is behind that. Public, aggressive, cold, brutal face is just a front. And you know, yeah, sure, they have to do work too, but if, you know, basically they've taken the, you know, they've taken a move that has taken the world by surprise and has created a completely new geopolitical issue. The ball is in our court, you know, the ball is in the Western court, as it were. You know, I think that the sensible thing now is to really work very hard to understand how to respond to that in a way which moves us forward.
And benefits us.
Yes, absolutely. So I do think that it comes down to, if we want to be more intelligent and not deal in a Cold War manner. And, you know, the Cold War there was stasis. It kind of worked insofar as there wasn't a Third World War. But it was pretty bleak time for people in this part of the world, and it wasn't much fun for people in the West either. So, you know, I think we need a different and more emotionally intelligent response, actually. And emotional intelligence may be in the deficit in Russia, and it may be in the deficit in the West too, but I think that's probably a way beyond the old models of trying to work out problems. There's no opposition. There's nobody. I mean, Navalny is a nationalist and a populist, and again, I've not met him personally, but a friend of mine who did run into him said he's a bit unpleasant, you know, personally, a bit dismissive sometimes of people. And Kasparov, really very right wing, actually. I don't see, there's nobody else really. I mean, the young women from Pussy Riot, very popular in the West, deeply disliked in Russia, basically because they've done a lot of things which aren't so well known in the West. You know, their performance, you know, in the cathedral is well known in the West. Some of the other agitprop stunts they've pulled off, anyone with access to Russian internet and Russian language skills can see everything that they've done, and some of it is really not very pleasant. And I think generally speaking, they're seen, most Russians don't like them at all, or they think, your regular Russian gopniki, the guys in the villages, just think they're a great laugh, and will share the videos, the more edgy videos of what these girls have done in the name of politics and art. So there isn't really anyone. I'm not, there's no civil society in Russia. So from where do these people emerge? Coming back to this point, I think there are opportunities for change, and I think there will be change. I just don't particularly see any major signs of where it's going to come from, and it may just spring from nowhere. Maybe it's bubbling under the surface. I think there's an awful lot going on the internet and on blogs, and there's a discrete kind of quiet dissidence that occasionally you will see when people suddenly appear for that, like that march the other week, and they're just ordinary people. Or a couple of years ago during the winter events, millions of people on the streets. And I do think that at some point, if the economy really gets into a bad way, and if those in power at the moment don't find a way to manage this carefully, and they are surely aware of this, things could change more abruptly. Sometimes things do change very abruptly in Russia, and that's what the current government are worried about, of course, and that's quite natural.
I hope you enjoyed this EHU Public Conversation. Please join us again for discussions with prominent individuals known for their thoughtful application of ideas from the arts and sciences. So long, and thanks for watching.